individual social groups happy. So the strong state and the character of the either rentier or remittance-based economy allowed the strong state to operate on side by side with the peculiar economic system that we see the Middle East being characterized by. And the final reason why the Arab Spring did happen was there was a general public dismay with this combination of the authoritarian state and the rentier and remittance-based economy. Because the authoritarian state, able as it was to tap into a reserve of wealth in the region by virtue of the political control they enjoyed in the various states, the states did not, most of these states did not aggressively pursue any alternative avenue of economic growth and wealth generation. So there are those countries, for instance, like Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, which have used their oil wealth in investing in industrial growth that would hopefully, they think, at some point in future, sustain the economy when the oil runs out. But the more well-off a country is in terms of oil wealth, the less inclined it is to invest in any alternative economic avenue. But the problem there is that the entire economy runs essentially on the state's continued ability to extend patronage. Now, in times when economic growth is dwindling, when the economy is slowing down, global economy is slowing down, as the ability of the state to generate more revenue by selling more oil begins to decline, the state's ability to extend patronage also reduces. And when the general economy is going out of control with high prices and high unemployment, the disaffection that happens immediately is focused against the authoritarian state, which is identified to be the principal source of the problem because of its incompetence in handling the economy properly and because of the lavish endowment that is there for governmental projects and state matters in which the state is interested. So the military in Egypt, for instance, never seems to run out of food, but food prices go from costly to exorbitantly high in the Egyptian market. So there was a dismay with this combination of rentierism or remittance economy and the authoritarian state. And the Arab Spring was essentially a revulsion against that particular combination. Now, if that is the case, then why did the Arab Spring run out of steam? What ultimately got resolved? In the 3 years that followed, the global economy, we are repeatedly told, has begun to improve. American economy is beginning to recover. Europe is coming out of recession. But if you look at the indices of Middle Eastern economy, the benefits are not immediately visible. There are reasons why the return to the path of growth has not affected the Middle East, but it's slightly off the cue, so I'm leaving it for the time being. What is most interesting is not so much that some countries managed to stabilize, some states managed to stabilize after a period of instability. The best example is Saudi Arabia, where there was a knee-jerk reaction in terms of quick political concessions. There was a massive economic shock, there was a huge bailout for people who might be in economic distress, but within 1 year, the Saudi regime had got its grip back on, and then they also helped Bahrain stabilize. The one thing that the Saudis did to bring this about was their patent solution for everything. When they are confronted with a problem, they throw more money at the problem, and basically they buy time. Saudi Arabian regime has a deep pockets, so they survived. The other regime that almost began to encounter the beginnings of the spring, when immediately the descent was botched, was in Jordan, where the actual reforms were undertaken, which anticipated many of the demands of the people. and that diffused the instability at the very outset. But if you look at the countries that have actually seen some change, the best example would be Egypt. There is now almost a full reversal. There was an elected legislature that was actually given powers of framing a constitution. Then there was an elected president who came to power, and then once some serious policy reforms were being introduced, suddenly all hell seemed to break loose, a second round of dissent, this time against the elected government. And now the president is behind bars, many of the parliamentarians have been stripped of their seats, and the power is now back to the military. What is the reason for this? If you go and ask an Egyptian on the street who voted earlier for change, has now voted for a second change but back in the old direction, the answer is very simple, that these people were bringing in Islamic, they were trying to bring about a change towards an Islamic society, but they were not addressing the real problems. The first part of the thing we'll handle later. Let's look at the second part of the thing. What happened is that there was no economic alternative roadmap that was being laid out by the Egyptian government. And you can say the same for the Libyan government, you can say the same for Yemen. In Egypt, the change was much swifter, because once the changes did not come as promised, the Islamic force, the Islamic coalition that brought about the Muslim Brotherhood to the office of the president, Mohammad Morsi, unable to satisfy the genuine policy reforms that were required, he began to bring about a set of changes that were addressing his own constituency, whose demand of Islamization was of long standing. He had initially put it on hold when he could see that the economic roadmap was not going to work. He began to bring about a political change which ultimately led to his downfall. But the bottom line was that the government was changed in 2011 with the demand that there should be an actual improvement in the condition of economic situation. There was no hint of that change. There was no indication that that change was coming. Let alone the change coming, there wasn't even any serious, discernible conversation, dialogue going on about reform. So, if there was going to be no change, then it was perhaps better to look for a regime that provided some kind of political stability and some kind of social, well, at least if not harmony, then lack of disharmony. The reason why this choice is increasingly considered by the Egyptians to be a wise one is if you look at the other government that saw a regime change and then did not see any economic change following. Okay, and as problems get deeper and deeper, in absence of a strong controlling influence that the Egyptian military exercised in Egypt, Libya is today virtually on the verge of disintegration. Despite having an elected government, the Libyan situation is moving from bad to worse, with a sizable chunk of the country now actually under the influence of Islamic militants who are not even Libyan in inspiration for most of the time. So, which way Libya is degenerating and how fast is it degenerating is a question that remains open even today. So the Egyptians are now actually saying that they are, in many ways, much better off in having brought the clock back to the hands, or brought power back to the hands of the military, because at least the military can effectively control the social situation if it cannot altogether do much about the economy. There are reasons to argue that this is overreaction in the face of what the Muslim Brotherhood was doing, but there are also strong reasons to argue that public dismay in this matter is well justified. The second reason why the Arab Spring has begun to slow down, and we are now appearing to be on the verge of on the verge of a meltdown, is that the state in the Middle East, in spite of the initial jitters that it experienced in 2011, is still a very strong state. It is too strong to be dispensed with. Its roots in the society are too deep for it to be dismantled too quickly. Many observers like me would now admit that we were unduly hopeful that some serious change would actually happen in Egypt, which, if it had happened, would probably have been far setter in this region, because a country that has as much influence clearly vested in the hands of the military. Egypt, for instance, it is said that Egyptian military manufactures everything from guns right down to pasta and detergent powder. Now, if a country's economy is almost 40% controlled by enterprise directly or indirectly run by the military, it is very difficult for them to come the way of complete privatization and denationalization, the way it was hoped that liberal reforms would take Egypt in the direction. Bahrain similarly turned out to be a state force much stronger than the dissenting voices, largely because it was bankrolled by Saudi Arabia into coming out of its zone of instability. And once again, the only exception that you can see by way of a strong state not proving strong enough was Libya, where the civil war is tearing it down. But this is because in Libya, the social coalition that Gaddafi used to hold power for as long as he did completely broke up upon his death. And when the successor regime that came in marked the defeat not only of Gaddafi the person but also of social coalition, the instruments of control of that state also disintegrated almost entirely. The only case in the Middle East that has seen a successful transition from a strong state to a state which is moving towards accountable government is ironically one where the Islamic movement emerged triumphant in 2011 and has recently been voted out of power in 2014. This is the government of Rashid Ghanouchi. And the reason is because while the Tunisian state was strong by comparison with states elsewhere in the world, among all the Middle Eastern regimes, it is no exaggeration to argue that the Tunisian state was the second weakest, the weakest one being Lebanon. The political dimension behind the meltdown, however, is the most interesting and perhaps the most disturbing. It is that here in the Middle East, for a brief period behind the smokescreen of optimism and hope, popular sovereignty was either deliberately or unwittingly confused with majoritarianism. And it did not work because there was no majority to extend majoritarian domination. What was happening was basically, in absence of a strong opposition that had been dislodged from power, most of these Middle Eastern states had one large group, perhaps the largest group, but definitely not one that enjoys the confidence of the majority of people, happened to scale the political divide and come to power. And then the moment they try to extend their domination in terms of serious change in the nature of the state, just as the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt, after the removal of Mubarak. From the very beginning, it was very clear that if there was only one single group that could come to power, that was the Muslim Brotherhood. But when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power and tried to bring about change, they realized, to their surprise and to the surprise of the rest of the world, that even in a Muslim majority country like Egypt, where there are deep pockets of Islamic subculture which secular authoritarian rulers could do nothing about, there was no sense of solidarity behind one single movement. And Egyptians would say thank goodness for that, because there were very devout Muslims who were deeply dismayed with the authoritarian rulers, had no love lost at all for the Muslim Brotherhood. So the mere assumption that a Sunni majority country would have a Sunni majoritarian rule and they would not bat an eyelid about it turned out to be, predictably in some quarters, a miscalculation. And therefore, the moment this minority group with a majority complex began to have delusions of grandeur and try to take on very strong vested interests for one reason or the other, they were thwarted. Again, a very good example away from the Egyptian theatre would be the Syrian civil war. When the civil war began in 2011, it seemed to almost everyone that it was a matter of weeks, if not months, that Bashar al-Assad would go. 3 years down the line, people like me who could see the writing on the wall now see that the wall has been painted over. And there is a strong possibility that Bashar al-Assad might survive in spite of butchering over a large section of his own population. The reason why he would survive is his opponents were also butchering, and they were butchering a larger and a stronger group of people. And now there are people who in 2011 had taken strong exception to the heavy-handed tactics of Bashar al-Assad, are today turning around and saying, well, between Bashar al-Assad and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Daesh Islamic State, we will go with Bashar al-Assad any day of the week and twice on Sundays. So, a number of factors, a combination of a number of factors had brought about those winds of change in 2011. And unlike what a number of optimists had believed, the winds of change were not strong enough to rattle the really strong forces of conservatism and authoritarianism in the region. So, to sum up the argument, I would say that the two things, that what we considered the Arab Spring in 2011, if it was an Arab Spring, turned out to be much briefer than we hoped spring would have been. The second thing, of course, is because in this particular respect I'm a rank optimist, I think I have to wait for a next round, because change would come, popular sovereignty would gain credence in the region. It would happen only as the state weakens, and the state would weaken when the economic chips are down. We are just waiting for the second round. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee, for the interesting presentation. Before we go into the question-answer session, we have some tea waiting outside. We may want a 5 minutes of tea break and reassemble for the Q&A.
That's very straightforward.